Ladies and gentlemen, dear students of the East European Institute, it is a great pleasure for me to welcome Professor Mihnea Constantinescu. Professor Constantinescu is a graduate of the Polytechnic in Bucharest with a master's degree in mechanical engineering. He holds also a master's in quantitative finance from the University of Zurich and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, and a doctorate in economics also from the University of Zurich. Professor Constantinescu is a prominent academic, policymaker, and entrepreneur active in Eastern Europe. He is currently a professor at the Kiev School of Economics and head of research at the Ukrainian National Bank. He is going to deliver a fascinating talk today that fits perfectly in our schedule for this semester on Digital East. So, Professor Constantinescu, welcome, and we look forward to your talk.
Many thanks for the introduction. I hope it's going to be fascinating. We don't have the equivalent of digital eggs and vegetables to be thrown at the professor if the talk is not good. But people can still complain, and they're welcome to express their complaints in case something is unclear, or if they want to challenge and bring you information to some of the things I'm saying. So
Exactly. So please feel free to stop Professor Constantinescu at any time during his talk if you have clarification points.
yeah, great. So the purpose of the talk, I think, is this implicit choice of government versus governance, and what digital changes in this. Let's start from, let's say, a relatively broad background. Government has been, unfortunately, very central to a lot of decision making in Central Eastern Europe, for better or for worse. The, let's say, culture of governance, not of government, but of governance, that we observe generally in Western Europe is not as developed, or at least it's only developing now in Central Eastern Europe. So you don't have this community-based initiative to solve issues at the regional, at the city level, at the regional level, and so on and so forth. This type of culture is only now sort of forming itself. The primacy of the government it's a relic that's very difficult to change, and what we're now observing is the emergence of these new forms of making decisions, bringing about decisions in forms of digital governance. And I think a component here which is exceptionally important is technology. We have now new technologies that have entered into this, primarily via payment. So you're probably all aware of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies and so on and so forth. And these are form of governance of how to move value among a number of users without the need of institutions, of established institutions. Okay, so this is the framework in which I'm going to try to sort of set the talk. There are particular aspects that I focus on, and the reason I'm focusing on these is because they talk about these, let's say, institutional weaknesses that we're trying to overcome, and ways in which we can sort of improve, in general, the governance process and all of its outcomes, social and economic. So, the first part is this a choice? Can we simply say government or governance? Isn't government supposed to deliver governance to its citizens? And the reason why I'm saying this is not necessarily a function that derives from government is simply because of these reasons I was telling you. Before. So it's not yet clear how this change at various hierarchies of organization is happening, right? So take the typical Western society. It's very well structured compared to an Eastern society in terms of state, region, city, maybe neighborhood. All these levels have different tools, have different constraints on governance processes. Okay, sometimes in Eastern Europe you find all these things mashed together, and it's unclear who's responsible for what, and so on and so forth. So let's, given this, let's say, start, let's look at some broad digitalization trends and how they are going to change a little bit this transition. So to put some words into perspective here, there's two different things we're going to focus on. So one is digitization, and this is a simple conversion of an analog artifact into a digital representation. So movies, sound, text, and so on and so forth is transformed from its physical form into a digital representation. Everything now basically becomes bits, zeros, and ones that the computer can store, transmit, and transform. Digitalization is a broader process where it involves the use of technologies to change an existing activity. And usually this change is geared towards increased efficiency or transparency. In many cases, and particularly if we look at the private domain, if we talk about economics, we're just reinventing completely new, markets, products, where we're bringing about new markets that haven't existed before. What are the pillars of this digitalization process? Well, it's the fact that we can now afford very cheap digital eyes and ears. This is the Internet of Things, so it costs us very little to capture light and sound and temperature and humidity via sensors, which have now become extremely cheap to produce. They can be installed virtually anywhere. And connected to the internet, they give us real-time insights into all sorts of processes at very low cost. We have a digital memory, apart from the typical database that you would have even on your computer. We have these new technologies called blockchains and digital ledger technologies. And we have, in a sense, digital brain. So, a function to replicate or extend human cognition, which is machine learning and artificial intelligence. So what we're basically doing, we're taking the human being, we're ripping it apart, ears, eyes, voice, etc. We are capturing this in binary form, 0, 1s. We are transmitting this over the internet, maybe storing it somewhere. And then we're using these new techniques of analysis, such as machine learning and artificial intelligence, in order to make sense of huge amounts of information. Okay, so what used to be a meeting before now becomes a huge database with a person trying to figure out trends and correlations and things happening inside. So this is the broad digitalization, in, let's say, transformation in which we are. A cautionary tale about digitization without digitalization. So digitization is the process of, remember, transforming stuff you have on paper in the physical realm in a digital representation. Digitalization is a much broader thing and says, okay, we have new technologies. Let's think about reinventing stuff anew, okay, to lower costs, to improve transparency, and so on and so forth. So Yahoo was the first to start digitizing the archiving process of a library. And why did Yahoo do this? Because they realized as soon as people started to have emails, that people were interested in not just sending emails around, but also searching for stuff. So Yahoo was among the first to have an idea about what the search engine should be. And nowadays, almost nobody uses Yahoo search engine compared to Google. And why is that? How can it be that Google, coming afterwards, was able to dethrone Yahoo, even though it had a huge user base? A lot of people had their first email, probably AOL and Yahoo had their email there. So what Yahoo did, it took the process of categorizing information from a traditional library, and it just replicated that. So it said, oh, okay, so let's do concepts. Everything with A starts here. Everything with B starts here. And then when you start searching for stuff, it's just going to give you stuff. If you're interested in electronics, it's just going to go in the category E, L, and it's just going to give you everything that it has with EL, starting with EL, and so on and so forth. And this wasn't a very inefficient process, because the way we go search for stuff in a library is quite different from the way we go search for stuff on the internet. Okay, so they digitized, they took concepts, they copied them, they transformed them in 0, 1s, and they reorganized them as they were organized 400 years ago. Whereas Google came in and said, well, let's try to find out what you're interested in and what is interesting. Okay, so your question about electronics might be about what? About products, about the physics of electronics, about particular videos or and so on and so forth, right? So they created an algorithm in which they rearranged information pertinent to a particular topic so that it's more interesting and relevant to the searcher, okay? Now, Yahoo digitized but did not digitalize. It did not transform the search process entirely based on the new technology it had in its hands, right? It simply moved stuff from the physical realm to the digital realm without transforming anything fundamentally in it. Whereas Yahoo came in, realized that information was growing exponentially. There would be no way in which a user would have the time, interest, or ability to just browse through endless categories, and said, okay, let's try to figure out what the user might be interested in and what is relevant. Right? And the search engine basically does that, just that, right? It creates a way to say what might be relevant in this particular domain based on how websites are connected between each other, right? So if there's links to a particular website talking about electronics, and there's many links going into that website, that's what's going to come up on top of your search. Of course, if you pay money to them, they're going to put you on top of the search, but that's the monetization part, which we're going to discuss as we proceed through and start talking about platforms. Okay, so this is basically the framework in which we're finding ourselves, and there's a lot of issues that need to be digitalized, a lot of processes, both public and private. Our focus is primarily public, of the public domain. And the idea is to reinvent public service, again, with public governance in the background, to invent it using these new technologies, right? Inside of this, so this, let's say, these three pillars of technology, which is Internet of Things, machine learning, and blockchains, there's a new way to organize markets for information and digital products, and these are platforms. Probably everybody's using some form of platforms such as Twitter, Facebook, etc., Bolt, or Amazon. What these platforms are doing, they are bringing again to the digital realm the idea of a market, but they are reinventing it to make things more efficient. In certain ways, the more efficient is what's keeping us there. The unfortunate thing, and we're going to talk about this, is that the data that's created in this process is used for pricing and, in a sense, for monopoly building and so on and so forth, right? So they've grown enormously important over time because they're providing a service that's useful, but it's unclear what if the long-term effects are also beneficial. So this is something we're going to look at in particular, because this, as soon as we start discussing issues related to transactions, the payments, and financial markets, and so on and so forth, we're going to look at the bank being turned inside out by platforms that basically decompose its functions into individual products. So they're so-called two-sided platforms. They're two-sided because they bring together multiple customers with multiple suppliers of a particular product or service. So 20 years ago, you can ask your parents, maybe 30 years ago, how they would choose a holiday, right? So what they would choose a holiday like, it would be either they would talk to some of their friends and family, and they would say, look, there's this really awesome hut in the mountains. I really suggest you go there, and so on and so forth. So information searching was very localized. It was very much socially based in a sense. And it was quite limited, right? So in terms of price discovery, quality checks, and so on, you had no clue if your idea of awesome cabin is the same as your neighbor or your friends or your cousin's idea of awesome cabin or awesome holiday. Okay? And what platforms basically did was to bring in all the customers and all the suppliers and to create an interface in which all of that information is helped into decision making for both the buyer and the seller. And what's essential here is that they brought this reputation-based system to lower informational frictions. So informational frictions is everything that's related to settling a particular transaction where one party knows a little bit, knows something that the other doesn't, or is unable to obtain that information, or is very costly to obtain that information. Okay, so now we can go online and see if other people think that this is an awesome thing. There's going to be the 5-star whatever review, and you can, you're in a much better position to make a decision about a particular area, about a particular segment and product. This is usually done for a fee. This is your typical Bolt or Airbnb, but sometimes these are non-transactional. And the non-transactional, one of the market sides is paying to get the consumer, to get to the consumer on the other side. So here we're talking about advertisers getting to the consumer via Twitter, via Facebook, and so on and so forth, right? So even though we get the feeling that we're not really paying for stuff on Facebook and Twitter, we're actually paying via our interactions. We're basically paying with our privacy. So that these profiles get created, what kind of guy or girl you are, what you might like, what you might not like, which could be ideas, which could be political parties, or which could be cars, phones, and holidays. Right, and here things get a little bit murkier, less transparent, because it's unclear exactly how your data is being used, and so on and so forth. What is the transformation? Well, the transformation here is that we go, before we would have, you'd have travel agencies, you would have a lot of people coordinating a taxi company and so on and so forth. That was a lot of labor. A lot of that labor now is no longer needed because the matching is done by the algorithm. There's more capital that's needed. Okay, so we're replacing maybe 1,000 workers of various degrees of competence with maybe 20 programmers and a bunch of 5 other IT engineers specialized in other things, and very expensive servers and a lot of energy being used in return. So question is, how do we intervene in these markets? How do we help, how do we help, let's say, overview such markets in which, let's say, a regulator normally is not even able to look in. Right? Many of these algorithms might be proprietary and so on and so forth. Now, this comes more or less at the time that we're talking about new ways of governance. So to try to make sense of this, I just put this thing here as a sort of a little structure of what it means, centralized versus decentralized. This applies very broadly. It's not just about money or payments, and it can look at it in various domains. So the typical centralized system, and we're not talking at all about technology here, we're talking about how we organize access to information, generally speaking. In a centralized system, you have a point of access, and many users need to connect to that point of access. Okay, so the user is identified, needs to be given credential, a password, and a username, and is able to then connect to this repository of information. The repository of information can be cats and dogs, as it's Facebook, but it could just as well be a bank holding information about your payments. Okay, so all these are centralized systems where information is held behind a wall, virtual wall, that you're allowed to look over only if you have the right credentials. These are fast systems. You can connect very, very quickly. They process information very quickly. They are easily scalable. That means if not a lot of users join this or need to use this, this is done very fast. They're very efficient, and they're easily audited. Now, some of these pluses were considered to be minuses if we start thinking in terms of, you want to log into Facebook and post whatever, and then Facebook says, well, I don't really like what you're posting for whatever reason, right? And this easily audited and regulated became a big issue. And this is present a little bit everywhere nowadays, where the big platforms are now asked to look into and to police, in a sense, information dissemination and content creation. So they're easily regulated, and this can be considered by some to be a minus. They're fault sensitive, and we've seen this when Facebook went down 6 hours or 7 hours. Everybody all of a sudden became more productive or started to talk to their friends and stuff for real. They're susceptible to censorship and political influence, right? So this type of arrangement, you can try to flip it around and to go into a distributed system. And in a distributed system, the information is now stored on multiple computers at the same time, and there is no one particular entity that controls what gets stored and so on and so forth. There's a piece of software that everybody installs on their computers, and this piece of software is, in a sense, some standards on how information needs to look like, needs to be structured in order to be transmitted between the computers. And that information can be a photo, can be a text, or can be instruction of a payment, as for example, is in Bitcoin or Ethereum. And there's no one particular entity that comes in and says, oh, this doesn't belong to the website, or this does belong to the website. Okay? So this distributed system, they're fault tolerant. You know, if one computer goes down, is not a problem. The same information is replicated across a number of other computers. It's resilient to attacks and to collusion, and it's pretty difficult to regulate. And of course, the pluses, well, once you go to the regulator, they become minuses. So in a sense, this, if you want to look at this, what blockchains and distributed ledger technologies do, they enable new forms of governance. So new forms of storing information and coming to a decision, regardless of the problem, by enabling this decentralization, right? Or let's say building on top of this decentralization. Okay, so these blockchains or distributed ledger technologies are new ways to store and transmit data without a central point of access in an environment in which one may have potentially malicious agents. So somebody's willing to forge information or to shut down the network for their own gain. Let me just, you know, I've put in a few ideas here, and I think we have time to just discuss very quickly what this is. So, you know, some of you have asked quite a number of questions about these blockchains and Bitcoin and so on and so forth. You know, the purpose of the talk is just to show you that this is a much broader technology, in a sense, a much broader way to organize governance. It has found a lot of applications now in payments, but it's being used in what are so-called decentralized autonomous organizations, or DAOs. These are, you know, an IT's way of responding to how to organize parties to reach a conclusion, to share resources and so on and so forth. So this parts of these technologies have been researched and have been developed for a very long time. There's a very nice book if you're interested. This with a with a focus on payments. It's uh, um, you have it here. This, I think it's, no, actually this is a paper. It's a research paper. The Narayanan and Clark 2017. It discusses the history of findings and research that underpins the current or parts of the current Bitcoin. So you see a lot of these technologies have been, in a sense, discovered in the IT academic world sometime in the 1980s, and they're pieces of a very large puzzle that come together in order to give us what are these now. Let's see, my computer is trying to close itself down. In what are these blockchain-based payment systems? Now, this is an example showing you why and how this becomes a governance problem. Okay, so I have a simple problem in a centralized organization, centralized consensus. This can be a government just as well as it can be a firm, or it can be a bank, and you can adjust in your mind a little bit this example to make sense of similar situations, even though some elements, might be a bit stretched. And I'm going to take that particular centralized organization, and I'm going to rethink it in terms of a decentralized organization, okay? Where again, technology is one part of the puzzle, but it's not the only one. Or let's say we cannot really start with technology, we need to start with a problem that's being solved. Okay, so given my my background, I'm starting to look at traditional bank incorporated. This bank has customer that comes in and asks for credit because they want to buy a house. And the bank has an internal model in which it decides whether or not to issue a mortgage, and in what at what level, right? So the customer comes in, says, I want 100,000 euros because I want to buy this apartment, and the bank needs to decide internally whether this should be issued, whether it should be 100 or 90, whether additional guarantees need to be asked or not. Okay. Why do we look at this? So let's suppose our traditional bank incorporated has an issue because its mortgage valuations are not very reliable. So there's substantial payment delays and there's substantial defaults and so on. There's a lot of issues happening there, right? And we are in a traditional setting. There's a director that has a bunch of analysts, and these analysts are the one who are, analyzing the requests. So the way it works in a centralized setting, each agent, each analyst submits a list of possible issues identified in the bank's mortgage application to the director. So customer comes in, submits a bunch of documents. One analyst is looking at them and says, well, this person doesn't have a long enough employment history. There's gaps. I don't understand how they were earning their money, and so on and so forth. This looks shady, right? So this could be an issue. The director is the only one who assigns the mortgages to the individual analysts. Okay, the analyst gets this, creates his list of issues, and submits it back to the centralizing authority, in a sense, which is the director, right? And the director will accept or reject the raised issue based on his or her prior experience. Okay, so all of this information is bilateral. The only one that sees what everyone is doing is basically the director. The director then keeps an open ledger on the department server, which is just an Excel spreadsheet with everyone's submitted issues and how these issues are resolved, right? So somebody could submit 10 issues. One issue is related to employment history. Another issue might be related to previous defaults on a consumer credit and so on and so forth, and how they're resolved, right? So somebody might submit 10 issues. The director says, yes, indeed, all 10 make sense, or might say, oh, 7 are complete nonsense, only 3 are accepted. Okay, and in this system, the director has a pool of bonuses that it splits according to the number of issues that the director accepts. Okay, and this is what it would look like. This is a typical spreadsheet where over time you have each agent's if each agent's submitted and accepted issues, as you see here. So for example, agent 1 has 30 issues accepted, agent 2 has 19 issues accepted, and so on and so forth. And we have the $1,000 or euros or whatever you want bonus pool, which gets split by the number of issues and then gets multiplied by total number of issues and then gets multiplied by each agent's accepted issues to get their share of the bonus. Okay, so over time you might have more or less issues accepted by the director. Therefore, you're going to have a higher or lower comparable share of that bonus. Now, what are governance issues in this setting? Higher effort of agents should lead to higher chance of identifying issues, right? So if you're carefully looking through all data and comparing this to existing statistical data, if you're looking at that particular customer's history and you're trying to gather additional information above and beyond what was submitted and so on and so forth, it's likely you might discover something else. But the director also wants to penalize issues that are submitted but just look like trying to look good to the boss, right? So let's say you have somebody who just submits wild stuff because they want to make it look as if they're working. Okay, so if there's many issues that are rejected, these can get penalized. Okay, so not only don't you get a bonus, right? They might withhold something later on. Now, of course, in this setting, you let it run, this governance, this fake artificial world, you let it run for some periods, and you might have agents starting to wonder, why is that? Why am I always getting so many issues rejected? Why is this particular person's, this other analyst's, why are his or hers issues always getting accepted, right? So the big question is, what if the director is cooking the books? What if the central authority is abusing its power in this governance mechanism? What if you would like to challenge this process, right? Because remember, what we're doing here is we're doing everything at the latitude. We're leaving at the entire decision-making process at the latitude of the director. This is based on my experience. This might be an issue. But as you proceed through time, this might or might not be an issue, right? So the director might reject an issue now. 6 months down the line, that issue might actually come up to be a real problem. Right? So you see here, there's a lot of potential friction points in how decisions are being made here. And this is a centralized setting. Okay? What if we want to now run a decentralized system?
Mihnea, may I interrupt you for a second?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
So essentially, I mean, this brings in mind this classical by now literature on soft budget constraints. I would also like to mention that today Janos Kornai also passed away, a very significant figure in East European economics of transition and comparative economic systems. So just to follow up on this concept of soft budget constraint, which is part of his intellectual legacy for economics of Eastern Europe. You suggest this blockchain and these algorithms on information accumulation prevents soft budget constraints or could prevent. So essentially, because it raises the informational cloud, because it reduces moral hazard. I mean, because so there is no issue anymore of adverse selection. So what? So in terms of this of a simple contract in a principal agent model framework, how do you think that?
Yeah, so let's say that these budget constraints which were implicit and opaque are now becoming explicit, and they can be audited by anybody who's looking at the blockchain database, because the way you set it up is to take into consideration what are possible conflicts of interest, and you can impose costs and benefits in order to guide action of the aggregate towards a particular goal. It's very much related to this. There's a lot of game theory that's going on inside here in order to arrange what information should be visible in what way. But overall, in a sense, it brings to light certain constraints which otherwise would not be visible. So I would say this is a good complementary way to understand soft budget constraints. It's an additional way in which they could be solved, like optimization problem with such constraints could be solved in, let's say, in an open way, right? As an open forum, right? Anybody who would want to see how many transactions are undergoing today through a commercial bank would have absolutely no ability to do this unless they are the regulator. But if you want to know how many transactions are ongoing through a public blockchain, you can just go and read this statistic at the second frequency. Right. So these are important transformations in a sense in terms of information asymmetry. I like to call them opaqueness because until now we would assume that there is information that someone knows more than others, but in a sense there's information that might never be seen unless you're looking at it through a particular lens, causal lens in your mind. And this is now enabled, right? So we can look at these realities depending on our causal models in a slightly different way because the data now becomes available. So this was the centralized consensus. We have our analysts. They're not happy. They consider that this system is inefficient for the bank because some issues are rejected, which end up being very prevalent over time. They might even consider the director is abusing his or her position. So these agents meet up and they decide that they want to challenge the entire process. Okay, to prevent the abuse of power coming from the centralized nature of the consensus protocol. So here consensus protocol means how decision is reached among these agents. The director is removed altogether, okay? So this sounds very revolutionary. It's very nice. It's no wonder why so many people are very much taken away by this sort of a romantic feel to it. To avoid the possibility of anyone altering the results of this by intent or by mistake, the file is saved and synchronized on each agent's PC, right? So before we would have one file, the master file that sits on the server of of the company, one person having access to write on it, many people having the right to see it, but not being allowed to write on it. You know, if somebody wants to alter some particular information, they could do this. The other people would not be able to intervene, and so on and so forth, right? So now we change this. There's not one copy. We go to a distributed system, and there's multiple copies on multiple computers. As soon as you come here, there's a technical issue, and this is, you know, in a sense, the smartness of these public blockchains is that we need to think about the consensus mechanism. That means, how do we reach a decision? Who gets to write on all the copies, and how do we ensure that only the relevant information is entered? Okay, so this is where the game theoretic considerations come in, and you're sort of thinking of how to arrange information chains over time so that it's not profitable to alter the past. That's this intensive mining and this intensive energy use, because the intensive energy use makes sure that if you wanted to change something in the past, you would be forced to change everything from that moment of the past going forward, which would require absurd amounts of energy compared to the current energy usage. Okay, so there's high high energy usage, but it would be completely absurd amounts of energy usage in order to change the past. That means to alter information, which could be, you know, a document or would be some numbers that represent your wealth or your transactions or your payments. So to resolve the issue of selection of relevant issues, again, we remove the director. How do we agree this is an issue? Well, each one of us has their own experience, and we all decide on a very democratic way to solve this. We vote. Okay, so each agent submits a proposed issue to the group, and then the issue is accepted if 51% of the group votes it is important. Okay, which is pretty much the same way a transaction is now being settled in both Bitcoin and Ethereum, vast majority of other such blockchains. Okay. Now, consensus here requires very specific knowledge, yeah, because each one needs to know how mortgages are issued and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is what is called specialized mining. In order to come to mine a conclusion, in order to mine consensus, to reach consensus, you need very specialized know-how. Whereas public blockchains turn this into a very simple puzzle. You have to guess a number by trying it many, many, many times. That's the energy usage. That's where the energy usage comes in, right? So that anybody can join this and can try out, in a sense, to find the lucky number that kind of guarantees your vote. Incentives are aligned across the entire team, right? Fewer issues in contracts benefit all, because now you have fewer losses for the group, assuming, you know, these are also the same people who would hold the capital behind the bank. But of course, you know, agents are friends among each other, and not to the same degree. They might guess who hides behind the anonymous masks, right? So how do we prevent collusion? How do we make sure that I don't vote for your issues, you don't vote for my issues? Okay, these are all important things to worry about, especially when you think about high stakes such as payments and transfer of value. So all the technical challenges and the technical solutions, they reflect behavioral dynamics and behavioral assumptions about our agents individually, but also in the aggregate. So in a sense, we are devising a system that implements voting, updating of files at the same time, and prevents arbitrary changes after the content of the file has been written. Where content of the file, as mentioned, it can be a constitution, it can be an online court, it can be a transaction, a payment, it can be transfer of title over land. Okay, so this is the nature of decentralized consensus. It's a mix of incentives and technology such that you create a trusted chain of data, and that data can be, as said, can be anything, that is very difficult to break. And you do that without a central counterparty coming in. Okay? Now, is a decentralized blockchain solution always needed, always good? The answer is no and no on both counts. Okay, so we always have to go back and look at what are the pluses of the decentralized solution. Is fault tolerance needed? what happens if one node is physically destroyed? Well, the cheapest way to do this is to simply create a copy and always keep synchronized copies of your stuff. Okay, this is the way Facebook works, Twitter works, right? So there's a bunch of servers that are pretty much replicating the information, so that if one of the servers goes down, the second one can work, right? Payment systems in general work like that. So there's 3 copies, there's 2 databases, one is known, one is semi-known, one is secret in a sense. Is data prone to manipulation? Are there incentives to forge transactions? If yes, then maybe you need some form to prevent this. If not, well, you know, you don't really care about this. And again, the story is, why would you want to change a posted picture of a cat? Now, if it's a posted picture about a political event and assassination, that's already a very different story. Is anonymity important? Quasi-anonymity. Do we need to know who's behind a username online? Do we worry about centralization leading to monopolistic behavior? And again, here, as soon as we start talking about platform economies, that's exactly what these platform economies enable. Right? So these platform models have enabled, in a sense, something that takes us towards monopolistic behavior in pricing and information sharing and so on and so forth. You know, I put the little Trump here because, again, this is the same story here. Like it or not, basically, this is intervening into the political making process. Is this the right way to do it? Is this the wrong way to do it? It's difficult to judge ex post, but it can potentially decide the outcome of an election. Okay, so all these are considerations that one could and should think about on this. And you see, in many cases, depending on the objective, we don't necessarily need this decentralized system. Okay, and I gave you here just 2 concepts on how this works. There's such a special function in cryptography. You know, computers talk to each other. The way they talk to each other is through hiding information behind, let's say, secret messages. Those secret messages are called hash functions. Okay, these are simple, well, not simple, but in order to understand this simply, this is a sort of unique fingerprint for a piece of information. Okay, I gave you a website there if you want to try it out. What this is, it takes an input such as text, image, sound, whatever, and it creates a unique identifier for that. So you see here, this is a secret message, and underneath there's the hash of this particular string. Okay, so you see this is a long string of numbers and of letters, which change dramatically if you change even the slightest thing inside of that message. So if instead of a dot we have a quotation mark, then you have a completely different hash. Why are these important? Well, they're important because if you see this uh, uh, awkward looking series of numbers and letters, there's no way you can backtrack and figure out what the secret message is. Okay, so if I show you the fingerprint, you do not know to whom it belongs. And the other very good thing about this is if the message is altered by anyone in any way, the hash changes in an unpredictable way fundamentally. Okay, so these 2 features are extremely important, and that's basically how information is being stored in a blockchain. Okay, that information, let's suppose, is simply a user 1 and the user 2 sending money one to each other. So here is, you know, I took Maria sending to Ina 11 units, whatever this might be. It could be in 11 units, could be 11 square meters donated out of an apartment, but it could be $11 or 11 euros or 11 shares. And, you know, the first position says that the Maria is paying to Ina, and then Satoshi is paying to Frank 50. Okay, this is the first block of information. All of this information is passed into that hash. It gets its own unique fingerprint, which you see there. And that unique fingerprint is matched together with the additional information that is coming into the database. And these unique fingerprints are basically becoming part of the subsequent fingerprints. Okay, so that's why these things are called blockchains, is because they're chaining together blocks of information, and it creates a chain of trust that if you look at the latest blocks, they hold the reliability of the information going back in time. Okay? And there's many types, there's many ways, as mentioned. Again, if you're following a little bit, there's this new all-time highs in Bitcoin, and now everybody's looking at it with some with worry, some with envy. But just like it, there are a number of other blockchains that are being launched and are being functional already for several years. And each of these blockchains is basically thinking about the problem that we thought about before. How do we go from centralized consensus to decentralized consensus in different ways? And it's putting emphasis on slightly different elements of the problem. Okay, so for example, Bitcoin is primarily about anonymity and censorship resistance. Ethereum is much more interested in functionality, so offering smart contracts and automated execution online. And here there's public, there's private, there's semi-private blockchain. So there's it's a whole universe. There's not just one. They come in all sorts of flavors and sizes and so on and so forth. So that's if you want a very, very rough overview of this. Now, the technology is really nice, and we said, well, let's try to just go back to where we were before. Just 1 second. So this is all nice and good. So one thing we could try to do is to leverage this technology to solve a problem where, again, the questions that were answered is fault tolerance needed, is censorship resistant needed. All of them were answered as yes, as opposed to no, in which I was trying to tell you, okay, we don't really need all of that stuff. Everything was answered as yes. So some of the first applications were actually in updating ownership rights of land. And there's a very interesting article, so I posted here the link. It's Google translated, so for those of you who understand Ukrainian, you can read the original. If you understand Russian, there's a Russian version of the website that presents the same news in Russian, but Google does a fairly good job. So this is an interview of what the old system of land ownership was looking like in Ukraine. So it's called the land registry, and it contains information on who owns what rights to what pieces of land. This system was in private hands until a few years back. They were not under the government control. Inside, there are forged identities. There are fictitious transactions. There are plots of land that were sold several times. There are plots of land that were invented in the middle of the city in order to enable construction, and this was done at the expense of other owners who were not aware of this. There's basically large-scale fraud to appropriate very valuable land and land rights, right? So people that knew that a particular area had mineral and gas resources were very keen in getting their hands on them. The IT system was basically a private database that could be, if you read through the article, which is a fascinating story, could be controlled externally, right? So just imagine that you would wake up in Germany to the scandal that somebody has access to the ownership database of all the land in Germany, and they could easily change the owner's name and the rights and stuff like that. Okay, so this was a huge problem and remains still a big thing to work through. In 2017, there was a first attempt that was saying, oh my God, this is terrible. Let's do blockchain, right? Why? Because, it seems that there's all these cool things that these solutions do. But this is not only a technical problem in a sense, right? So the proposed solution basically failed simply because there was no institutional support to push it through. And the lack of institutional support was simply potential loss of centralization benefits. The centralizing party, whoever that was no longer able to sell pieces of land arbitrarily or change ownership rights and so on and so forth. So in 2020, there was an audit to this, and eventually the solution that was adopted was a centralized solution. And there's a huge audit still ongoing on this, together with the World Bank, looking at what pieces of land were sold several times and so on and so forth. And why this was very important is you can't have a functioning market of people selling rights if the rights are not insured, or renting out for agricultural production for 20 years out, and so on and so forth. Right? So without this preliminary step, which looks pretty technical and kind of boring, but is absolutely essential, there is no land market. And again, if you go through this article, you're going to get another link that tells you how the land market is developing nowadays, which again, it's a very nice technical solution to this, because once you establish that you have ownership, you can go to this other website that gives you a valuation for the piece of land, and you can set it out in a sort of an auction system if you wish, and so on and so forth. So technology is part of the thing, but digitalization, or how do we digitalize, has to be very much linked to the context, and has to be linked to the problem that's being solved. Blockchain can solve, for example, a lot of problems if you have institutional support to ensure migration. If you do not, in 2017 there was not, this in a sense was almost like a lost opportunity in this respect. I still believe at some point in time we might have bits and pieces, not necessarily in Ukraine, but in countries where this is feasible and the transition can be ensured, we can have bits and parts of this information being stored publicly in an openly shared database. So context is very important. The end user is very important. So we talk about, for example, super fancy technologies, and these people are just going to sell their land over blockchain. But this is our typical end user. It's a person that has little or no digital skills, and vast portions of the populations in Central Eastern Europe have a relatively poor basic digital skills. Yes, of course, there's a flourishing segment of the economy with IT and so on and so forth, but these just show the fragmentation in general of the society. So you have a few people who are extremely skilled. They can derive great benefits and get great jobs, but there's a vast portion of the population that barely understands how to use e-banking. Now, on top of this, we have the typical problem that sort of everybody has, but it's exacerbated. We have disinformation that creates new forms of governance challenges. In a sense, the state is too weak or non-existing in essential areas of public life, like health, education, security, and so on and so forth. There's good, role for regulation, pan-European regulation, but perceptions are changing very rapidly, and I think this attachment to the EU core values, which are very important, are not yet there in terms of how people deal with issues on a day-to-day basis. Yeah, so I just put down a little article. There's if you're reading the news, you're seeing that there's huge number of infections in many Eastern European countries, and this shows this huge gap in terms of governance, in terms of health, and so on and so forth. Very cynical way to go about this. So there's this, I put down this article. There's a high-ranking priest that basically says, "Oh, we're praying for all those sick and doctors treating those in the hospitals," but the same priest is not asking these believers to stay at home. Instead, he's encouraging them to go out for public masses and stuff like that. So the level of cynicism is incredible. And again, the state seems impotent or unwilling to go in and sort of regulate these type of things. So digital transformation in a population that doesn't trust official information sources and so on and so forth, it's very challenging. It's very challenging to do. Now, of course, I gave the example of this land registry. There's been similar attempts, and some of them have been relatively successful also in Georgia. So if you're looking for this, there's a couple of very interesting articles, 2017 to 2018. In South America also, so of course is not necessarily our geographical focus, but the type of problems are very similar. Economic development is being hindered by the lack of rights to land. Primarily, there's no way you can build an economy in a sense without these rights, and all these are laboratories on how these technologies can be implemented, and their benefits and their costs. One of the things that you're probably, again, if you're into this area, you've read about in the press is the adoption of the law that regulates private currencies, cryptocurrencies in Ukraine. So this was adopted, I think, about 2 or 3 weeks ago. It's not in the final form, but basically what this does, it creates a legal framework for transaction, investment, and so on and so forth in public, in private digital money, such as Bitcoin and Ethereum. And it, at the same time, it encourages central bank to work further on the e-hryvnia, which is a pretty advanced concept of digital public money, adapted, if you wish, for the let's say for the digital economy. And again, here the idea is to leverage these new forms of governance by a different balance of centralization versus decentralization, where data access rights are essential, particularly if we think about trying to break down monopolies of platforms and enable a more transparent data economy. So you kind of know where your data is being used, by whom, to what purposes, so that it's not being used against you, so that you end up being sort of priced out of certain things of the market, and you have no clue why the algorithm considers you to be not worthy for credit or whatever, and that's simply because of data biases in how the algorithm was trained. And in a sense, an epilogue, I don't know if this is the right way to look at it, but if we go back to the chart on digital skills, you see that we have tremendous potential to change the works of public bodies, but this works of public bodies need to have a demand, right? So if the end user does not understand that it can be done and it should be done better, there's no way that this transformation is going to take place. And I think the big risk here is that we're going to end up with some fractions of the population that are going to be extremely well off. And here we talk about graduates in IT, people with some level of entrepreneurship, and so on and so forth. But if the government is not updated itself as well at the same time, there's going to be vast parts of the population is going to have no clue what's going on. So that's why I'm thinking that this has the potential to tackle inequalities, but it has also the potential, if mismanaged, to create increased inequalities if we don't generally upskill the society, not just the labor force, and invest in education. It sounds a little bit like a broken record, but this seems to be, at the end of the day, one of the main sources of why these inequalities persist over so many years. That's it on my side. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mihnea, for this fascinating talk. Now I will conclude the recording so that we can continue to the discussion.